Henry Jackson stepped up to the counter at the main branch of Jackson Heritage Bank in downtown Dallas, his worn sneakers squeaking on the polished marble floor. At 70, he was a black man with thinning gray hair, dressed in a faded plaid cotton shirt and old jeans, there to withdraw $5,000 from a savings account his son Thomas Jackson, the bank's CEO, had set up for him. He placed his ID on the cold stone counter, but the employee behind it, a young woman with blonde hair tied up high, barely glanced at him before pushing the card aside. Her tone was sharp and curt. "Fill this out." No greeting, no smile, no warmth. Henry stood still, his hand resting on the counter, a flicker of familiarity crossing his eyes at this treatment. In just a few minutes, security would be called, and he'd be dragged out like a criminal, while white customers walked away with thick stacks of cash, unquestioned. But this bank didn't know they'd just denied the wrong man. Once his true identity was revealed, they'd see who really held the power here. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the latest stories. Henry Jackson stepped through the glass doors of Jackson Heritage Bank on a scorching morning, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden streaks across the glossy stone floor. The doors slid open silently, letting a blast of cool air from the AC hit his face, carrying the scent of polished wood and faint perfume. Inside, the bank buzzed with the clatter of typing, the steady chime of the service bell, and the hushed voices of employees in sharply tailored suits moving briskly behind the counters. Customers stood in neat lines, waiting their turn, while light from the glass created crisp reflections on the floor. It was a machine running smoothly, just as Thomas had built it from his early startup days. But today, Henry wasn't there as the CEO's father, not for meetings or events, just as an ordinary customer wanting to withdraw $5,000 from his personal account, a task anyone should be able to do without trouble. He wasn't wearing a suit or an expensive watch, just a faded plaid shirt, old jeans, and dusty sneakers, a figure blending into the morning crowd. As he ventured deeper inside, Henry's sharp eyes caught a middle-aged white man at the counter ahead. The man, in a charcoal gray blazer with neatly combed hair, chatted with a young female employee. She counted crisp stacks of cash, arranged them neatly, and slid them across, with a beaming smile. Henry squinted, catching the figure on the slip, as the man turned. $10,000. He watched the man tuck the money into his jacket, nod a thanks, and stride out, his polished leather shoes gliding silently across the floor. No questions asked, no verification needed, no hesitation. He left with a thick stack of cash, unquestioned. Henry followed him with his gaze, his breathing slowing, jaw tightening briefly, before he reminded himself to relax. He'd seen this scene too many times in his life. Years ago, when Thomas was still a boy, Henry had stood at another bank counter in Dallas, a crumpled pay stub in hand, asking for a few $100s to fix his car. The clerk, a white man with thick-rimmed glasses, glanced at his dirty work clothes and pushed the form aside. "We can't help you," he'd said, voice flat, eyes cold, as if Henry wasn't worth the time. That night, Henry sat at the kitchen table, a weak yellow light shining on his tired face, vowing his son would never face that. Now, standing in a bank bearing his family's name, he hoped that promise held for him too, not favoritism, but basic fairness. Henry approached the counter, his old shoes clacking on the stone floor, a sound out of place in the seamless efficiency of the place. He didn't rush, keeping a steady pace as he'd lived his whole life, patient through tough days, raising Thomas on meager wages from fixing trains. He paused, taking in the space again. The tall glass reflected his image, a small old man, in simple clothes, among a crowd dressed far fancier. An older white woman, with an expensive handbag, glanced at him curiously, before looking away. A young male employee, in a navy suit, passed by without a greeting, as if he were invisible. But Henry didn't mind. He was used to being overlooked, judged by his clothes, or skin, before anyone bothered to ask his name. Henry took a deep breath, pulling his ID and savings book from his pocket. He set them on the cold stone counter. Sarah Evans, her name on the tag pinned to her navy vest, pushed his ID aside without a close look, her voice curt, "Fill this out," as she slid a blank form toward him. Henry studied her face for a moment, eyes narrowing, as if searching for a hint of kindness, but finding only mechanical indifference. He didn't react quickly, slowly, pulling an old ballpoint pen from his shirt pocket, then bending to fill out the withdrawal form with deliberate, clear strokes. $5,000. It was procedure, he knew that, but the way Sarah treated him, no greeting, no hello, or how are you, felt off. He finished, sliding the paper and ID back across. Sarah picked up the form, but didn't glance at the ID. She eyed the amount, then promptly pushed both back, her voice stiff. "We can't process this transaction." Henry frowned, his finger brushing the edge of the rejected paper. "Excuse me," he asked, his deep voice clear, tinged with surprise and confusion. Sarah didn't blink, crossing her arms. "We don't handle large cash withdrawals like this." Henry tilted his head, his gaze shifting from her to the glass doors where the white man had left with $10,000 just minutes ago. "I just saw that guy walk out with $10,000 in cash," Henry said, pointing toward the entrance, where the man in the gray blazer lingered faintly on the busy sidewalk. "You didn't hesitate with him." His voice was calm, but carried the weight of undeniable truth. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flicking away from him, for the first time, not in shame, but as if provoked. "That's different," she replied, her tone clipped, almost cutting him off. Henry leaned slightly forward, hand still on the counter, his voice steady, but now edged. "How exactly is it different?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She turned her head slightly, glancing toward the glass office at the back, where a middle-aged woman in a gray suit stood with arms crossed, watching with a discreet but icy stare. Henry followed her gaze, catching sight of her. Margaret Lawson, branch manager, from a nameplate he'd seen on a visit with Thomas. Margaret nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Sarah to straighten up, as if bolstered by her boss's silent approval. When Sarah turned back to Henry, her eyes were colder, harder. She took a short breath, as if tired of the exchange. "I've already told you, we can't process this transaction." Henry breathed slowly, staying calm on purpose. "And I'm asking you why," he replied, his voice even but now firm with unshakable resolve. Sarah didn't respond right away. She tapped her neatly manicured nails on the counter, a slow rhythm, as if stalling. Finally, she sighed, tilting her head slightly, her tone shifting to a fake sweetness. "It's just unusual, that's all. A big cash withdrawal like that, it's suspicious." The word suspicious hung between them, heavy and deliberate, like a stone dropping into Henry's chest. He let it sink in, a familiar, painful feeling rising, the sense of being seen as a threat, an outsider, just because of his skin or the worn clothes he wore. He knew this game, had played it his whole life, navigating unspoken rules that decided who got trusted without question, and who had to prove their right to exist in spaces like this. "You didn't find it suspicious when he did the same thing," Henry said, his voice still steady, still controlled. No need to point, both knew who he meant. "So tell me, Sarah, what's the difference here?" Something flashed in Sarah's eyes, a brief hesitation before she regained composure, shaking her head. "Sir, I don't make the rules." Henry let out a short, humorless laugh, a dry sound echoing in the bank's quiet. "You don't make the rules," he repeated, his voice dropping like a gentle accusation, "but you sure know how to apply them selectively." Sarah stiffened, her lips tightening, eyes sparking with irritation. "I need to get my manager," she said abruptly, her tone curt, turning on her heel and striding toward the glass office, without waiting for his reply. Henry stood still before the counter, his fingers tapping lightly on the cold stone, his gaze following Sarah Evans as she hurried to the glass office at the back. Her high heels clicked steadily on the marble floor, blending with the service bell and the clack of keyboards from other counters. He didn't move, holding his calm stance, but inside a familiar feeling stirred, the sense of being sidelined, seen as someone who didn't belong, all for things he couldn't change. The air in the bank grew heavier, a vague tension settling in, though those around him pretended not to notice. The glass office door swung open, and Margaret Lawson stepped out, her heels ringing sharply on the stone. In her mid-40s, she wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, hair neatly pinned up, her cold eyes masked by a professional demeanor. She stopped at the counter, arms crossed, her gaze sweeping over Henry with subtle scrutiny, but no friendliness. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice smooth and polite, the kind used for difficult customers. "I hear you want to withdraw a large sum today." Henry met her eyes directly, nodding slightly. "That's right," he replied, his deep voice clear. Margaret offered a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid we have security protocols for transactions this size," she said, her tone even, like she was reciting a script. "To ensure the safety of our customers and staff, we have to be extra cautious with high-value withdrawals." Henry crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly, his posture shifting, as if weighing her words. "So what exactly does that mean for me?" he asked, his voice still calm but edged with a challenge. Margaret held her fake smile, her eyes narrowing briefly, unaccustomed to being questioned. "It means we need to verify some additional information before processing," she replied, her tone sweet but condescending, as if doing him a favor by explaining. Henry exhaled through his nose, a slow breath, his gaze shifting from her to the glass doors where the white man had left with $10,000. "You mean my information," he said, his voice lowering, "because you clearly didn't need to verify anything when that guy withdrew more than me." Margaret's smile didn't waver, but her jaw tensed for a moment, a small sign she didn't like being cornered. "I can't discuss other customers' transactions," she said, her voice sharpening slightly, "but in this case, I need to verify your fund's source and latest balance." Henry felt his patience thinning. He glanced at the form and ID still on the counter, untouched by Sarah. "You've got my account number right there," he said, pointing at the paper. "Look it up." Margaret stiffened, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "I'll need your cooperation, Mr. Jackson," she said, using his name for the first time, but her tone was a warning, not respect. Henry let out a short, dry laugh, sharp with surprise. "Cooperation?" he echoed, his voice gaining an edge. "I'm standing here giving you everything you need to do your job, and you still find reasons to deny me. That's not protocol, that's discrimination." The word discrimination rang out in the bank's quiet like a slap, sharp and irrevocable. He saw it in Margaret's quick blink, in how Sarah, now behind her, froze, in how the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what came next. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, as if choosing her next words carefully. But she didn't look away, her eyes locked on him, and for a fleeting moment, a smirk crossed her lips, a smirk that said she thought she still held control. She raised her hand, a small but sharp gesture toward the corner. A figure moved. Kyle Bennett, the bank's security guard, a tall white man with a rigid stance, stepped away from his post near the entrance. His heavy boots thudded on the stone floor, his eyes flicking from Margaret to Henry. He didn't hesitate, moving with a slow, menacing rhythm, as if ready for an unnecessary escalation. Margaret didn't glance at Kyle. She didn't need to. The silent command was given. She kept her gaze fixed on Henry, waiting, as if expecting him to back down. "I'll ask you again," she said, her voice still smooth, still perfectly professional, as if she weren't orchestrating his removal. "Can you verify the source of these funds?" Henry's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on hers. "My pension," he answered, his voice steady but firm, "like every time I've deposited into this account." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking to Sarah, still statue-like behind her. "And can you tell me your most recent balance?" she pressed, her tone laced with mockery. Henry stared at her, a heat rising in his chest, but he kept his face unchanged. He felt the eyes around him, other staff pretending to work, nearby customers bowing their heads to avoid looking. The older white woman near the service desk, clutching her handbag, shifted as if to speak, then stopped, lips pursed. Henry ran a hand slowly across his face, exhaling through his nose, forcing his voice to stay calm. "You've got my account number right there," he said, pointing at the form. "Why don't you look it up?" She didn't answer his question. Instead, she raised her hand again, a small but sharp gesture toward the corner, a wordless command. Kyle Bennett moved instantly, a tall, broad-shouldered white man in a black uniform, his rigid stance unbroken. His heavy boots echoed on the marble as he approached. Henry didn't budge, his eyes shifting from Margaret to Kyle as the guard drew near. Kyle's steps were slow but threatening, his hands loose at his sides, but poised to act. His face was blank, his eyes scanning Henry, like he was a minor obstacle to clear. Margaret didn't look at Kyle. She didn't need to. The silent order was issued, and she expected compliance, as others had given before. "I'll ask you again," Margaret said, her voice still smooth, still impeccably professional, as if she weren't arranging his exit. "Can you verify the source of these funds?" Henry's jaw clenched, his gaze unwavering. "My pension," he repeated, steady and firm. "Like every time I've deposited into this account." Margaret tilted her head, her lips pursing, as if his answer were a petty annoyance. "And can you tell me your most recent balance?" she continued, a hint of sarcasm in her voice, as if she knew he couldn't. A surge of heat flared in Henry's chest, but he kept his expression steady, his hands tightening slightly. He glanced at the form, and ID still on the counter, unchecked by Sarah or Margaret. "You've got my account number right there," he said, pointing at the paper, his voice sharper now but controlled. "Why don't you look it up?" Margaret didn't reply. Her faint smile lingered, but her eyes grew colder, as if she'd long decided he didn't deserve an answer. Kyle stopped beside him, close enough for Henry to feel his presence, a towering shadow looming over him. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Kyle said, his voice flat, emotionless, like Henry was a chore to handle. Henry turned slowly, meeting Kyle's eyes, searching for a hint of doubt or awareness, but finding only indifference. He took a deep breath, keeping his face unchanged, though a fire smoldered inside. He knew this script: a black man deemed a threat, in a place he belonged. "I'm a customer," Henry said, his voice low but clear. "I have a right to be here." Kyle didn't pause. He reached out, his large hand gripping Henry's arm, fingers tightening just enough to press. Before Henry could react, he was yanked back, his shoulder hitting Kyle's solid frame, as the guard spun him toward the door. A gasp came from somewhere in the crowd, maybe the older white woman near the service desk, but no one spoke up. "What the hell?" someone whispered, but no one stepped in. Henry's feet slid on the stone, as Kyle shoved him forward, the push stronger the second time, nearly throwing him off balance. He tried to steady himself, but another shove came faster, harder, and his back slammed into the glass door with a loud thud. Pain shot down his spine, but Henry refused to let it show. He wouldn't give them that. The door swung open under the force, and he stumbled out, the hot Dallas morning air hitting him like a slap. Kyle stood in the doorway, arms crossed, staring down at him with cold indifference. Then came the final humiliation. Henry's ID, the proof they'd refused to acknowledge, the evidence of who he was, tumbled to the sidewalk before him. The small plastic card landed with a dry snap, lying still on the dusty concrete. Henry stared at it, the fire in his chest blazing, hot and nearly uncontainable. But before he could move, another figure appeared. Darius Reed, a black guard in his 30s, approached from the corner, his unreadable eyes paired with shoulders slumped from a weariness beyond the physical. Darius bent down, his fingers lifting the card with a care almost reverent, brushing off the dust before handing it back to Henry. "This place," he whispered, just loud enough for Henry to hear, "always does this." Henry took the card, his fingers brushing Darius's briefly before the guard pulled back. Darius sighed, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter if you've got degrees, papers, or keep your head straight, and do everything right," he said, his voice dropping with the weight of silent years. "They don't want us here. Not in the offices. Not up top. We're guards. Janitors. Numbers they need to look like they care. Darius Reed, the black guard who'd picked up his card, stood beside him, his eyes shifting from Henry to the glass doors, where Kyle Bennett still stood watch with cold indifference. This place, Darius repeated, his voice low, always does this. Henry didn't reply right away. He looked down at the card, his calloused fingers brushing the plastic edge, then lifted his gaze to Darius. Not today, he said, his voice quiet but firm, a vow to himself. He pulled an old phone from his jeans pocket, its screen cracked from a drop months ago. His eyes squinted, straining to see the numbers in the harsh sunlight. Let me help, Darius said softly, reaching out. Henry nodded, handing him the phone. Call Thomas, he said, his voice deep. Darius punched the speed dial, his eyes flicking toward Kyle, as if ensuring no interference. The phone rang once, twice, then Thomas Jackson's voice came through. Dad, what's wrong? Henry took a deep breath, his voice steady but heavy. You need to get to the main branch right now. Before he could say more, Kyle stepped out from the glass doors, his eyes sharp as he saw Henry still there. I told you to leave, Kyle said, his tone rigid, his hand reaching to snatch the phone. Darius moved fast, slipping the phone back to Henry, and stepping between them. Enough, Darius said, his voice low but resolute. Kyle backed off a step, his gaze wavering between Henry and Darius, but he didn't advance. Henry gripped the phone, hearing Thomas on the line. Dad, I'm on my way. The call cut off, and Henry pocketed it, his eyes meeting Kyle's without fear. He stood there on the sidewalk, the sting of being thrown out still burning, but his face stayed unchanged. He recalled other times, doors slammed shut, judging stares, baseless rejections. But today, he wasn't alone. Thomas was coming, and Henry knew his son wouldn't let this slide. Darius stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes drifting to the glass, where Margaret Lawson and Sarah Evans carried on, as if nothing had happened. This'll be interesting, Darius murmured, a faint smile flickering. 10 minutes dragged by, feeling like an hour. Henry didn't sit, didn't lean against the bank wall, just stood tall, his gaze sweeping the busy Dallas streets. Through the glass, he saw Margaret back at the counter, speaking to Sarah with sharp, disdainful gestures. Kyle lingered by the door, glancing at Henry now and then but never holding it. The older white woman from the service desk, who'd watched him curiously, was gone, likely unwilling to see more discomfort. Henry didn't blame her. He knew people often chose the sidelines. Then a sleek black sedan pulled up, tires whispering on the pavement. The door flew open before the driver fully stopped, and Thomas Jackson stepped out. At 40, Thomas was quiet authority, a perfectly tailored black suit, short neat hair, and eyes sharp enough to silence a room. He carried no noise or show, but his presence cut through the air like a blade. Henry looked at his son, a faint smile crossing his lips, not from joy, but from trust that justice was near. Thomas crossed the sidewalk, his eyes finding Henry instantly, his face hardened, restrained anger flaring as he saw his father outside the bank, clutching his ID. He didn't pause, didn't greet, just nodded slightly to Henry before pushing through the glass doors. Darius followed, his eyes glinting with hope. Henry stayed put, not rushing back in. He wanted Thomas to handle it, to see how this bank bearing their family name would face the truth. Inside, the bank's atmosphere shifted as Thomas entered, his sharp gaze sweeping over every face, from Margaret Lawson, behind the counter, Sarah Evans frozen like a statue, to Kyle Bennett near the doors. Staff stopped typing, customers turned, the service bell fading before his presence. Margaret, at the counter, spun around, and met Thomas's eyes. Her face stiffened, a flicker of unease passing, before she forced a professional smile. Mr. Jackson, she said, her voice steadying. I didn't know you'd be coming today. Thomas didn't reply at once, his eyes scanning the room, pausing on Sarah, head bowed, then back to Margaret. Clearly, he said, his voice cold as steel, because if you did, this wouldn't have happened. Margaret straightened, trying to hold her professional air though her lips trembled slightly. "Mr. Jackson," she said, forcing calm, "it seems there's been a misunderstanding here." Thomas cut her off instantly, giving her no room. "There's no misunderstanding," he said, his voice slow but razor-sharp. He glanced at Sarah, head down, hands clasped tight, then back to Margaret. "The only thing confusing me is why my father was denied a transaction and thrown out of our family's own bank." A dead silence fell. Sarah paled, her eyes widening as if struck. Kyle stiffened by the door, his hands dropping from their crossed stance. Margaret blinked, then blinked again, her perfect confidence crumbling for the first time. Her mouth opened, but no words came for seconds. She started, but Thomas didn't let her finish. "Save it," he said, his voice slicing through like a steel blade. His eyes locked on her. He turned to Sarah, now shrinking behind the counter. "You denied his transaction," he said. Not a question, but an accusation. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat stammering. I was just following procedure." Thomas tilted his head, his gaze unrelenting. "Procedure," he echoed, skepticism clear in his tone. He let the word hang, weighing on everyone present. Then he faced Margaret, his voice deliberate, each word a hammer. "Tell me, Margaret, did you check his account before deciding he wasn't fit to withdraw his own money?" Margaret took a sharp breath, her confidence cracking visibly. "Sir, she began, but Thomas cut in. "Yes or no?" he asked, his deep voice knife-sharp, leaving no escape. Margaret hesitated, just for a fleeting moment, but it was enough for Thomas to see through. He exhaled through his nose, a slow, intentional breath, his eyes sweeping the room, from Sarah, to Kyle, to the staff, pretending to work but clearly listening. He let the silence stretch, letting it press down, letting them feel the weight of what had been exposed. "My father," Thomas said, his voice rising, clear and resonant in the bank's hall, "Henry Jackson, is the man who inspired me to build this place. The account he used is one I set up for him. His money, our family's money. Yet you denied him, threw him out, didn't even bother checking the system." He paused, his eyes locking on Margaret. "Did you know who he was?" Margaret didn't answer, her lips pressed tight, her face flushed, not from shame, but from being cornered. Thomas stepped closer to the counter, pointing at the computer in front of Sarah. "Look up his account right now," he ordered, his voice quiet but commanding obedience. Sarah fumbled at the keys, her hands trembling, eyes down. The screen lit up. Henry Jackson's account clear, sufficient balance for a $5,000 withdrawal, no issue. Thomas glanced at it, then back to Margaret. "Nothing suspicious here," he said, his voice dropping, "just blatant discrimination." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing her. "You didn't deny him because of protocol," he said, his voice now cutting like a blade, "but because you saw him, a black old man in old clothes, and decided he didn't belong." He paused, letting his words sink into everyone there. "But you were wrong. He doesn't just belong here. He's why this place exists." Henry, still outside the glass doors, heard every word through the crack. A faint smile crossed his lips, not from glee, but pride. He saw Sarah bow her head lower, Kyle edge toward the door, as if to vanish. Margaret standing still, her face a mask of strain, but he knew it wasn't over. Thomas hadn't come just to talk, he'd come to act. Thomas turned back to Margaret, his eyes no longer restrained anger, but cold resolve. "You're done here," he said, his voice calm, but final. Margaret stiffened, her mouth opening. "Sir," Thomas cut her off instantly. "Effective immediately," he said, as if she hadn't spoken. "And if I find out this kind of treatment happened to any other customer," he paused, his eyes shifting to Kyle, then back to Margaret, "you won't just lose your job, you'll answer to the law." Henry, still on the sidewalk, watched through the glass, his hand gripping his ID. He saw Margaret falter, Sarah bow lower, Kyle retreat as if dodging Thomas's gaze. He didn't smile, but a wave of relief washed through him. Not for revenge, but for justice finally served. Thomas stepped closer to the counter, his voice deep but clear. Unnecessary. You threw my father out like a criminal, refused to check his papers, refused to look up his account. You knew what you were doing. Margaret flinched, her hands clutching the counter's edge for balance. Thomas didn't stop. He turned to the staff in the hall, his eyes sweeping over them, from those faking busyness to those too scared to look up. Everyone involved in this will take mandatory anti-bias training, he said, his voice not loud but heavy with unyielding authority. He paused, his gaze landing on Kyle, including security. Kyle dropped his head, his eyes avoiding Thomas, his hands hanging limp as his rigid confidence faded. Thomas turned back to Margaret, his voice lowering but sharper. And you leave now. We'll investigate how many other customers you've done this to. If I find even one case, you won't just be out of a job. He let the words hang, their legal threat clear. Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She turned, heading to the glass office, her heels clicking weakly, stripped of their earlier arrogance. Thomas faced Sarah, trembling behind the counter. Process my father's transaction, he ordered, his voice soft but enough to spur her into action. Sarah typed frantically, her hands flying over the keys, eyes down. A minute later, she counted out crisp $5,000 stacks, arranged them neatly, and slid them across with shaking hands. Thomas took the cash, his expression softening as he turned to the glass doors where Henry waited. He stepped outside, Dallas's heat enveloping him, and handed the money to Henry. Yours, Dad, he said, his deep voice thick with respect. Henry took it, his calloused fingers brushing the bills, his eyes meeting Thomas's with a faint smile. Not for the money, for how his son had stood up for him. Thank you, son, he said, his voice low but warm, his hand briefly squeezing Thomas's shoulder in a small but meaningful gesture. Thomas turned to Darius Reed, still nearby, his eyes glinting with surprise. And you, Thomas said, his tone gentler now. You're promoted, area security lead, starting today. Darius blinked, his shoulders twitching, as if in disbelief. He started, but Thomas raised a hand to stop him. You deserve better than working under people like this, he said simply, then looked back at Henry. Henry met Darius's gaze for a silent moment. He slipped a small stack from his cash, and offered it to Darius. Take the day off, he said, his voice deep and sincere. Darius frowned, hesitant. Sir, he said, but Henry held his gaze, unwavering. Take it, he repeated, and Darius slowly accepted, his fingers clutching the bills with a slight nod. Thomas glanced back into the bank through the glass, where Sarah stood still, head bowed, and Kyle slunk into a corner. I'll clean this place up, he said, his voice low but resolute, his eyes meeting Henry's. Not just for you, but for everyone. Henry nodded, his gaze softening. You did good, Thomas, he said, his voice carrying quiet pride. Henry looked at the cash in his hand, then at his son. This wasn't just his money, it was the recognition, the honor stripped from him minutes ago. He turned, walking away from the bank, waving off Thomas's offer to drive him. I can manage, he said, his voice deep and firm, his eyes gentle but determined. He wanted to leave on his own, as he'd arrived, with his old shoes squeaking on the sidewalk, but now with his head held high. Thomas watched him go, his father's figure fading into the Dallas crowd, a faint smile on his lips. Henry paused at an old wooden bench in a park he often visited. After morning walks, he sat under an ancient oak, its cool shade pooling around him like a soft blanket of memory. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on his time-worn face. He tilted his head back, eyes tracing the patches of blue sky peeking through the swaying branches. In that moment, Henry let his mind drift to the past, days soaked in sweat and patience. He recalled doors slamming shut, rejections tied to his skin, stares that shrank him in a society he'd still helped build. All of it, he'd buried in his heart, kept living, kept raising his son with kindness and grit. And today, as Thomas, the son he'd raised through sacrifice, forced a bank to face the truth. to bow to justice. He couldn't help but smile. But it wasn't for victory. It was a father's smile, seeing the seed he'd planted take root, a belief that his son would carry on the path he'd left unfinished, forging a fairer world, one small, quiet, rippling step at a time. Inside the bank, bearing their family name, Thomas stood tall in the grand hall, light streaming over the rows of staff watching him silently. His gaze was sharp yet calm, unshaken. "Starting today," he said, his voice echoing through the space, "we begin anew, a bank free of bias, free of discrimination. Here everyone is respected equally." It wasn't just a statement, it was the start of a full overhaul, a journey Thomas drew from his quiet father, Henry, who'd taught him through his own life that worth isn't in looks or status, but in how we treat others. Henry stood, heading toward Oak Cliff, head high. He knew change didn't come in a day, but today, he'd proven something. Justice begins with the courage to face unfairness, and that was his legacy. For Thomas, for the future. The story of Henry Jackson and Thomas Jackson in Black Old Man gets denied service at his son's bank. The manager gets fired on the spot. Mirrors real issues of racism and injustice still present in the U.S. today, especially in financial services and public spaces. Henry, a 70-year-old black man, was denied his $5,000 withdrawal at Jackson Heritage Bank because of his simple appearance, old shirt, worn jeans, and his race, while a white customer took $10,000 without a hitch. This contrast highlights the ongoing reality of racial profiling in America, where people of color often face suspicion or unfair treatment in everyday dealings. Thomas's intervention, as the bank's CEO and Henry's son, and the instant firing of Margaret Lawson, show the power and duty to change systems from within, a vital need in today's society. The lesson here isn't just Henry's patience or Thomas's authority, but how each person can act against injustice. When Henry firmly said, "Look it up," and pointed out the unfairness compared to the white customer, he held the bank accountable. Thomas, rather than ignoring it, used his position to reform company culture, ordering anti-bias training and promoting Darius Reed, the black guard who helped Henry. In real-life America today, you can apply this by speaking up when you see unfairness, whether it's a hurtful remark or a biased policy. Document it, seek support from those in power like Thomas, and persist in demanding fairness. More crucially, if you're in a leadership role, use your influence to shift the system, as Thomas did, so no one endures Henry's humiliation over their skin or clothes. The story reminds us justice doesn't come on its own. It takes courage and concrete action from each of us. Subscribe to the channel to follow stories of justice and change like Henry and Thomas's journey. Thanks for joining us today. See you in the next video for more deep life lessons.